This morning's sermon hinges upon the question of land. Who does it belong to? How shall we understand our relationship to it? What does it mean to claim, as Woody Guthrie did, this land was made for you and me? I offer it to you on the Sunday before Indigenous Peoples Day, as the news comes about an ongoing conflict over land in another part of the world. The events of the weekend are already being called Israel's 9/11. What has happened in the last 48 hours represent that country's greatest intelligence failure since the Yom Kippur War, when almost exactly 50 years ago, a coalition led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on the Jewish state. In this country and throughout much of the English language media, the voices we are most likely to hear are those of the Israelis and their allies. This morning, both the New York Times and the Washington Post ran pieces centering the opinions of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. As I speak, Israel is in the midst of launching a massive counterattack. But over the next few days, I suspect it's going to be hard to find Palestinian or dissenting Jewish voices condemning Israeli violence in the publications I just named or in other major media outlets. So let me offer you three, all from respected academics who I follow on that platform that used to be known as Twitter. The first words I share come from the national security expert and former Middle East advisor at the Pentagon, Yasmin El-Gamal. She writes, "What is happening in Israel is not okay. It is horrific, horrendous, outright barbaric. What has been happening in Palestine under occupation is not okay. It is horrific, horrendous, outright barbaric." The way to write this starts with believing both of these statements to be true. I lift up El-Gamal's words because they stand in parallel with the long-held Unitarian Universalist perspective that every person has inherent dignity and worthiness. The second set of words come from Eli Cook. He was a Harvard classmate of mine. He currently serves as a professor of United States history at Haifa University in Israel. He reflects, Hamas could waltz into those kibbutzes and towns because the Israeli Defense Forces shifted all of its troops to the West Bank in order to protect violent right-wing settlers while they terrorize local Palestinians. I'll say it again. Israel must end the occupation before the occupation ends Israel. I offer Eli's statement, a Jewish-Israeli voice of dissent, as a reminder that Hamas's violent attacks are situated within a larger political context. They come at a time when much of the Arab world has decided to make some kind of peace with Israel. In recent months, Saudi Arabia has been seeking to normalize relations with the nation. In 2021, the United Arab Emirates became the third Arab country to do so, following Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. Of greater significance is the rise of Israel's current government. It is the most right-wing and disrespectful towards Palestinian rights in the nation's history. Netanyahu's Minister of National Security, to cite one example, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is an advocate of expanding settlements into Palestinian territories. He lives on an illegal settlement himself, is affiliated with a group that was only removed from the United States list of terrorist organizations in 2022, and has used hate speech to incite violence. In 1995, he was involved in organizing a rally opposed to peace with the Palestinians, during which protesters screamed, "Death to Rabin." Yitzhak Rabin was the Israeli prime minister who signed the Oslo Accords, which granted Palestinians the right to limited self-determination and was seen as establishing a pathway to a two-nation, two-state solution. A month after that rally, Rabin was assassinated, and today Ben-Gurion calls for the stripping of rights away from Arab Israeli citizens. Finally, I put forward a sentence from Shireen Sekleh. She's a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who studies 19th and 20th century Egyptian and Palestinian history. Her name might be familiar to some of you. She was a guest on our Ministers Forum back in 2021. She succinctly observes, "Decolonization is not a metaphor." Decolonization is not a metaphor. Prior to Hamas's attacks on Israel and the Israeli response, the heart of my sermon was meant to focus on a theological concept called the Doctrine of Discovery. Have you heard of it? In 2012, the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association passed a responsive resolution repudiating it. The resolution came at the request of organizations that our association had been working with in Arizona to oppose the state's racist anti-immigrant laws. When we began to work with them back in 2010, we learned something surprising. They viewed Arizona's laws as part of a continual process of colonization that stretched back to Christopher Columbus. Columbus's discovery of land prompted European political and religious leaders to apply to this hemisphere something that's now referred to as the Christian doctrine of discovery. This is the belief that because the territories of the Western Hemisphere were without Christians prior to 1492, they were free for the taking upon discovery. With this doctrine in mind, the coalition of indigenous and migrant activists that our association was working with in Arizona called Unitarian Universalists into a new theological understanding. They wanted us to grasp that the issues at stake in immigration law are as much religious as they are political. In the United States, the history of the Christian doctrine of discovery can be traced to a series of papal bulls and treaties between Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. These documents created a theological and legal framework to justify the expropriation and division of indigenous lands, first between Spain and Portugal, and then later between all of the other European colonizing powers. What is particularly upsetting about the doctrine is that the framework it created to facilitate the seizure of indigenous lands continues to form the core of much of this nation's property law. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision Johnson v. McIntosh. The ruling in the case revolved around the transfer of land title. It determined in this country that indigenous nations could not transfer title to individual property owners. They could only sell land to the federal government. legal scholar and citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma, Robert Miller, summarizes the matter this way. The Supreme Court said that under discovery, when European Christian nations discovered new lands, the discovering country automatically gained sovereign and property rights in the lands of non-Christian, non-European peoples, even though the native peoples already owned, occupied, and used those lands. Now, a Supreme Court case from 1823 might seem like ancient history, but as recently as 2005, the Supreme Court cited this theological doctrine in one of its decisions. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation. In it, she asserted that even if an indigenous nation repurchased ancestral lands that had been previously part of a reservation, those lands could not be reincorporated into tribal property. They remained under federal, not tribal, control. Remember that the treaties between indigenous nations and the United States hinges upon recognition that indigenous nations are sovereign entities. And so recognizing that these lands belonged to the original inhabitants rather than the United States was somehow a threat to U.S. sovereignty. As a point of reflection on the doctrine and the way it continues to haunt us, I draw our attention back to Woody Guthrie's song, "This Land is Your Land." The first verse runs, of course, "This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to New York Island. From the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me." This might seem like a little bit of a problematic text to use in a discussion on the doctrine of discovery. Guthrie was a European American. His song almost sounds like a celebration of European conquest. It makes no acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of the land that European Americans call the United States and our indigenous brethren know by a variety of names, including Abaya. The song references California and the New York Islands, but not the tribal nations, be they the Ohlone or the Algonquin, that are the original inhabitants of those lands. It could be argued that Guthrie's "you and me" excludes indigenous peoples and inserts European dominance over their communities and lands. There are, however, other verses to the song. Whenever we use it during our services, I like to make a point of using the ones that have been somewhat sanitized from the history books, the original verses that Guthrie wrote back in the day, which include one of my favorite all-time lines. "As I went walking, I saw a sign there, but on the sign it said, 'No trespassing.' But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me." In thinking about the doctrine, I want to suggest for those of us who are primarily European descent, the task is twofold. First, we need to move from thinking about the sign of the sign with the words private property to thinking about the other side. Second, we need to enter into right relationship with the land and its original inhabitants. The first is about learning to erase the borders that we have created within our minds and understanding how those borders were created. The second is working towards reconciling ourselves to our Mother Earth and all of her peoples whom our ancestors harmed and whom we continue to harm through the ongoing process of colonialism. I've been thinking about the urgency behind this twofold process as I've been reflecting on another one of the week's disappointing pieces of news. Speaking of the Biden administration's decision to waive environmental and human rights protections so that it can speed up the construction of a border wall between Texas and Mexico. As the current administration works to complete what the indicted previous president called a big, beautiful wall. Wildlife corridors along the Rio Grande will be destroyed. The lands of indigenous people like the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe will be bisected. Many sacred sites and burial grounds will be desecrated. The federal government's decision to proceed with the construction of the wall comes at a time when undocumented migration has reached a recent high. It arrives after months of public boasts by Texas officials about their cruelty towards some of the planet's most vulnerable peoples, refugees and migrants. Instead of greeting those who seek a better life in the United States with open arms and hearts of compassion, they offer the cruelty of saw blades and buses. The cruelty of saw blades. Living in Texas, we are in the borderlands. It's not a comfortable territory to live in, said the Chicana activist Tijana and academic Gloria Anzaldúa. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is and will be again. She wrote those words in her classic 1987 text, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. We're discussing it all this month as part of our series, Lives of the Spirit. But for now, as a further invitation into theological reflection on the upsetting news of the hour, I offer you a few more words from Borderlands. I press my hand to the steel curtain, chain link fence crowned with rolled barbed wire, rippling from the sea where Tijuana touches San Diego, unrolling over mountains and plains and deserts, this tortilla curtain turning until El Rio Grande, flowing down to the flatlands of the magic valley of South Texas, its mouth emptying into the Gulf, 1,950-mile-long open wound, dividing a pueblo, a culture, running down the length of my body, staking fence rods in my flesh, splits me, mi raja. This is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire. But the skin of the earth is seamless. The sea cannot be fenced. To show, El Mar does not stop at the borders. To show the white man what she thought of his arrogance. Yamea blew the wire fence down. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, is and will be again. Where am I? If I ask you that question, how might you choose to answer? Perhaps you would reply that we are in the sanctuary of the Unitarian Universalist congregation on Fannin St in Houston, in Texas, in the United States of America. Or you might answer differently. You might say that we're in the land of Six Flags, France, Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the Confederate States of America, the United States of America. Perhaps you would simply say that I am located on the unceded ancestral lands of 6 different nations, the Acoshia, the Atacapa, the Carrizo, the Xochitlcan, the Carhuacana, and the Sana. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is and will be again. Where am I? It is a question that lies at the heart of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Like the United States, Israel is what scholars call a covenant state. Secular or religious, its foundational myth relies upon the belief, encoded in the Hebrew Bible, that God formed a covenant with the ancient Israelites that included the promise that they would win the land from alien and evil forces. Now, don't take these words as questioning Israel's right to exist. My probing of the doctrine of discovery causes me to question the way in which we humans constantly construct borders rather than challenge one specific state. It's one reason why I say to Jasmine El Gamal earlier, what is happening in Israel is not okay. What has been happening to Palestine under occupation is not okay. The way to write this starts with believing both of those statements to be true. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Challenging the doctrine of discovery, seeking to engage in decolonization, to transform the ongoing colonist mindset so prevalent in Texas is not something we should engage in out of some sort of pity for the oppressed or marginalized. Instead, we should engage it with the understanding that all of us, whatever our ethnicity or race, are victims of colonialism. For the borders that the U.S. government and our European ancestors have inflicted upon the earth afflict all of us and create this situation of ongoing climate disaster, of saying that the earth is a resource to be exploited. Interrogating the doctrine of discovery can help us to understand our complicated relationship with this system of borders. Most of us comply with it and participate in it for a mixture of reasons. We benefit from it in some way. We cannot imagine another system, or we are afraid of the violence that might be inflicted upon us if we rebel against it. Unitarian Universalist religious communities like this one can play a role in helping us as individuals and stewards of institutions untangle our complicity with these systems of border. By untangling our own complicity, we can ultimately try to be part of a process of imagining a different way. The great Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams envisioned our religious communities playing such a role when he suggested a vocation for the church and the minister. That vocation is, he said, to reveal the hidden, to point to the hidden realities of human suffering, and also to point to the hidden realities that offer release and surcease. The doctrine of discovery is one of those hidden realities, one of those hidden sources of human suffering that needs to be uncovered. It's not something that's mentioned in most school books. I did not learn about it in elementary school or high school or even in my undergraduate studies. I've heard little mention of it in the media, in the mass media, but despite this, it remains persistent within the United States, persistent within the country's case law, a theological interpolation into a supposedly secular society. More importantly, it shapes the way so many European Americans and others think about our relationship to the land and to each other. Many of the people who the United States government seeks to keep from crossing the borders into Texas are descendants of the original inhabitants of the land. To give an example, the state of Texas here is part of what's called the Uto-Aztecan lingual region. It stretches from Oregon all the way down to Honduras. And for thousands of years, members of this linguistic group moved freely throughout the region. The borders of the United States now prevent such free movement. These borders were established by the doctrine of discovery when Europeans claimed the land for their own. The descendants of the original inhabitants are now labeled as immigrants, while descendants of the European colonizers claim to be its legitimate inhabitants. The hidden reality that needs to be uncovered about the doctrine of discovery and the border system is that they are products of the human imagination. They're not real in the same way that a rock or a river or a human being is real. They were created in human minds, and they can be uncreated in human minds. We all, no matter who our ancestors are, can imagine a world where they do not exist. This is a task for the religious community, to open up the human imagination to vistas beyond the doctrine of discovery. To return to the lesser-known verses of Guthrie's song, it is to realize that both the sign and the words on the sign are human creations. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. So says Joy Harjo. There is no separation between past and present, meaning that an alternative future is determined by understanding our past. Our history is our future, says Nick Estes. Tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day. Violence rages between Israel and Palestine. Immigration, ongoing colonialism, conflicts in the Middle East, these are not separate issues. They're each connected by a belief in those objects created by human imaginations, borders. To see peace, to transform the politics of cruelty into a politics of compassion requires a different imagining. We are called to rid our minds of the imprint of the doctrine of discovery. And do so we may cease to think of people as immigrants or citizens of this country or that, but understand that we are all one human family journeying through the same lands together. Then the land will not be your land or my land. Instead, we will understand that we are not owners of the land, but its children. All of us, no matter what our ancestry is, draw sustenance from the same earth, are blessed by the same sun, are nurtured by the same air, and sustained by the same water. And that truth is more powerful than any border or doctrine. Again, Gloria Anzaldúa. But the skin of the earth is seamless. The sea cannot be fenced. El Mar does not stop at borders. Again, Joy Harjo. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Language comes from this. Remember the language, dance languages that life is. Remember. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.